everybody, and welcome to the Bare Root Project. I'm your host, David Kearnsy. I'm a forestry technician, urban forester, and an all-around nerd when it comes to trees, shrubs, landscaping, and plants. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm really excited to actually introduce one of my favorite subjects, fruit trees, and furthermore, fruit tree production, because what good is a fruit tree if it has gross tiny fruit? We're going to be talking about fruit tree varieties that grow in Canada and about the hardiness zones to help you choose which fruit trees or shrubs are good for you. We're also going to talk about what influences fruit production, as well as what are things that you can do to help increase or decrease the fruit quality or abundance to help you get what you want out of your fruit tree or shrub. I'm pretty excited about it, and I hope you are too, so let's get into it. Now, regarding where we're talking about, trying to grow these fruit trees, I'm going to stick to places in Canada. So what we want to make sure is that when we're talking about fruit trees, we're looking at the hardiness zones. Obviously, the trees and shrubs that are found in Ontario are a little bit different when it comes to cold hardiness as those found in, say, somewhere like northern Saskatchewan. Now, because I live in Saskatoon, we're in a zone 3B, and a lot of the fruit trees that we grow are going to be hardy for this zone. Now, that's not to say that they wouldn't do well, say, in northern Ontario or southern Ontario where you're looking at a zone 5. But trying to get that tree to grow in a colder environment than what it's zoned for can be much more difficult without looking into winter hardiness protection. So, what are the trees that we can grow? I have experience with apples, plums, pears, cherries, hascaps. I mean, we have a bunch of stuff, right? If you're native to Saskatoon, then you'll know that Saskatoon berries are actually a very popular shrub. When I first moved here, I thought it was hilarious because I was talking to a homeowner and I was like, oh, your service berries are looking great. Lots of flower production. I think you're going to have a lot of fruit this year. She kind of looked at me with like a funny look on her face and she goes like, you mean my Saskatoon berries? I thought it was absolutely crazy because, there's going to be some regional differences on what one plant is called over another area. The reason I thought it was funny is because service berries or Saskatoon berries are actually native and abundant all the way across North America. So I thought it was pretty funny. Now, getting back to all the other fruit trees, we're going to see plants that are in areas like Victoria, BC. They're going to be almost like tropical plants. Now, those species we're not going to actually get to grow in areas like Midwestern Saskatchewan because it's just not going to be able to handle the winter. So that's an important aspect when we're trying to figure out what plants we can actually choose. Now, the reason I bring this up is because sometimes when you go to a big box store, they will bring in trees or shrubs that aren't actually rated for the area that they're selling them. Not listing any names, but for the gardening aficionados, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about here. One of the biggest things is making sure that your fruit tree or shrub is cold hardy for the zone that you're planting it for. The reason is because we don't want to increase the unnecessary stresses that the tree or shrub is going to be going through. Okay, so you've picked out a plant. Now we have to look at what do we do with the tree or the shrub once we plant it? Well, one of the most overlooked maintenances that needs to be done is pruning. Pruning is really important. So when do we prune, you might ask? Well, let me answer that for you. Like most fruit trees, pruning should be done when they're dormant. So that means when the last leaf drops in the fall, you have until that bud starts to swell the following spring to get any crossing and rubbing, any dead wood, any diseased wood, and maybe some structural pruning too, depending on what it needs. But you only have, in Canada, that can be quite a long window, but you only have that amount of time to get all that done. Now, the reason that we're trying to do it while it's dormant is actually really important, and let me tell you why. The first reason is because we don't want a waste of energy. Now, when the roots have the energy in the early spring, it's going to start sending that up the vascular tissue to stimulate spring growth and flowering. Now, if we wait until after that happened and then we cut the branch off, then that's a lot of energy that could have been used even better somewhere else further down the line. The other really important aspect to look at is the activity of insects and disease. Now, obviously, insects aren't climbing around the tree in the middle of the winter. So what we want to do is we want to limit what's called the volatiles that the tree's giving off. Every time you cut a branch off, it's going to release a volatile into the air. Now, that is going to attract insects. Not all insects are bad, but when we're looking at fruit production, we want to make sure that we manage the stress that the tree is going through quite closely. And that means watching for insects and disease potential. Now, the other side of this is disease. Now, we want to make sure that if you're dealing with something like fire blight, you're sure as heck not going to prune it in the middle of the spring when rains are heavy and that issue is actually in the prime of, okay, I've infected this part of the plant, now I need to infect that part. So it'll actually rely on things like rain. This is why we want to make sure that we're planning our pruning when the tree and the insects and the diseases are most likely to be dormant. Now, there's a bunch of different pruning styles. We can look at ornamental shaping, which is kind of like if you took a hedge trimmer to an apple tree and then went in and cleaned and spaced all the cuts as well as did the crossing and the rubbing and the structural prune. That can actually increase flower production. We'll talk about that later. The other styles I'm sure you'll see in places like orchard is, the orchard style prune where they come in and they'll actually take out most of the growth going upwards and bring it to a low horizontal or a downward angle, obviously ideal for picking. Now, the third option is going with a more natural tree-chosen form. So instead of trying to manipulate the tree into one growth habit or another, you just kind of follow what the tree wants to do. Some are naturally taller than others, some are a little wider, some produce more fruit, some produce less fruit. I mean, the varieties are endless when we're looking at individual options of, say, a cherry or an apple tree. Sometimes going with a more natural shape or a more natural look is just going to increase the potential of the tree being healthier and enjoying its environment a little bit more. So when you're pruning a tree, you're obviously looking at the overall shape and the form that you want it to be. However, you got to make sure that you're taking out the crossing and the rubbing, the deadwood, the diseased, that all is very important. And we can do that annually if you're really interested on, doing minor corrections, trying to spread out the removal of debris from the tree. But in a lot of cases, you can get away with maybe only truly pruning it maybe once every few years. Now, an important thing to remember is you need to know whether the fruit tree that you're pruning is fruiting on this year or last year's growth. So that's important because it's going to dictate when exactly you prune. So when you want to increase fruit production, which we're going to get into in a sec here, you'll want to make sure that you take into consideration when it's okay to prune that tree and when the ideal time is to prune that tree based on what effect you're trying to get from it. All right, we're getting into something a bit more interesting. What influences fruit production? So I look at it like this. It's the tree's natural balance between health and new growth and the need for reproduction of the species, right? So, are you going to pay the mortgage and go to work to better your life, maybe build on an attachment? Or are you going to go to party in Las Vegas with your friends, have a bunch of kids, and kind of worry about your problems next week? In the tree's case, next year. Now, that's like a very dumbed down version. I mean, trees are going through this constant reassessing and reacting. And so When you look at, say, fruit production and the stresses that it's encountering during the day, the week, the month, it's taking all this information in and trying to make a decision on where it stands in the environment, how healthy is it. Based on last year's growth, how much resource does it have to continue this year? And, furthermore, how much water's in the soil? Like, how many resources are actually available for healthy quality growth? We're talking about all the nutrients, all the resources. That means water, sunlight, soil type, nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the micronutrient scheme, the pH of the soil. There's going to be all these different kind of variables that are going to affect the health of the tree and therefore the quality and the health of the fruit. Did you ever notice that the best, ripest fruit was always at the top of the tree? I mean, one of the most overlooked aspects of managing fruit production is actually looking at the consistency of light throughout the canopy. And this can be a really hard thing to manage because you want to let in just enough light that the apple producing spurs on the interior of an apple tree are receiving sunlight to increase the quickness of it ripening, as well as the even of the ripen, right? And the idea is that you want this on top of the fact that you don't want to overexpose the canopy because too much sunlight is going to increase the tree's requirements for water. If you're looking at, say, in the Midwest prairies, there's not that much water to go around if you have apple trees in, say, an acreage setting. So we can use this to our advantage. I mean, if you look at annual crop of one fruit tree to another, we're going to see some highs and lows from one year to another. Now, if you anticipate that it's going to have a high fruit production year, then if you, say, wanted to decrease the amount of risk and stress that this fruit production is going to incur on the tree, what you can do is actually water the tree just before the tree goes into its flowering mode. This is going to help ease the tree into this kind of stressful environment where it has to make a decision on, branch growth or flower growth, fruit production or pay the mortgage, have a house or die. These are the decisions that the tree's got to make. So if you help it with, say, water and sunlight being appropriate at certain types of the year, you can start to see that we can actually influence to some degree how much fruit and what the quality of the fruit is going to be. So if the water and the sunlight is appropriate, then the last thing we need to really worry about is, okay, are the nutrients there? Now, in an urban environment, we're removing all of the debris that would normally decompose in a forest, which is, if you didn't know this, where trees are from. So because we're raking up the grass clippings, because we're raking up the twigs and the branch debris and all the leaf, we're going to have a reduction in nutrients cycling back into the soil over time. So if you start noticing that your tree is looking a little chlorotic, meaning, hey, it's not looking very green because the chlorophyll is starting to die, then we can actually see that, okay, that's when we start using things like nitrogen. Using fertilizers, you have to remember, is more about supporting what the plant is naturally doing at that point in its cycle than it is to, try to force it to do anything. Now, fruit production, because it's a stress-related act, we can't just throw a bunch of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium at it and think, well, it's got all the nutrients you need. That means more fruit. It's not really how it works, so we have to be careful when and how we apply these nutrients to the soil. And that means that you can't just not fertilize your tree and push it further into stress to increase the fruit production, because that's going to kind of help towards what we call the death spiral. So as you start to get a little bit of decline because of variable A, and then you get some decline in health because of variable B, and then you're an animal and you never water or fertilize your tree, essentially what we're going to have is a buildup of deadwood, and then decay can set in. And then once you have fungus in your tree, Then you start looking at structural issues, which means that one good branch you had that you had hacked back 10 years ago and it just kind of sprouted out over the years of you forgetting it is finally going to fail because it's got a heartwood decay chasing upwards through the stem. Now, I mean, that's obviously the worst case scenario, but you can see how these issues can really start to compound on the tree. And what we want to do is balance evenly between, providing the right amount of stress and, giving the tree the resources it needs to deal with that stress. So in those years where you're hopeful, where, hey, we're going to get a lot of fruit, that's the year that you want to give the tree a lot of water so that it doesn't just continue into that spiral of saying, oh no, this is a year of have not. And the guys fertilized me every year, but all of a sudden there's no nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium. And all of a sudden, all of this is just so much for me to handle that I get overwhelmed. Well, the problem is it wasn't all of a sudden. It was a slow kind of creeping sadness that bestowed itself upon your tree. And I mean, it goes without even noticing. I had a fruit tree in my backyard, and because it was close to a fence and I didn't really love it all that much, I let it become this absolute monster that I got to deal with this year. So you can see how this is kind of a cycle. And every year you either have an increase in energy and production, or you maintain it, or you have a decrease. And so that's going to affect the following season's fruit production and general health. So how do we do it? How does Dave play God with plants? Well, taking everything we've talked about so far, or everything I've said into a mic by myself in my living room so far, we want to remember that nature is going to decide what this year is going to be in regards to fruit production. So we want to try to mimic nature and try to just make small changes within its natural cycle to get closer to our goal of either more or less fruit. So that brings us to our next subject, how to influence the fruit growth ourselves. Well, I'll break it down into parts for you. First thing we're going to look at is actually the pruning. So we can prune to increase or decrease fruit production. That's an easy first step. If the tree's well maintained, it can handle a healthy prune, and you look at the form and the outcome of what you're trying to produce, you can actually increase or decrease fruit production. We do this by removing fruit spurs if required, and we try not to in most cases. The other thing that we can do is limit how many spaces, say in a cherry, that it's actually going to produce fruit. If we do a reduction on a branch of a cherry or on a twig, and we do a reduction down to a bud, we do this by pruning the end of the branch off. That will increase the amount of fruit production because it's going to produce fruit at that location as well as where it was producing fruit below that from a previous year or a previous cycle. In a lot of cases, this actually explains why trimming a shrub can increase how much it flowers, because you're cutting off new growth and creating a new area for the tree or the shrub to produce fruit from for the following season. So pruning can be actually our best friend when we're trying to manage the health of the tree. And so it's worth spending a little bit of money if you don't know how to prune to have a professional do it for you. Or if you're lucky enough to live in Saskatoon, you can always hire me. Little shameless plug here, because I actually teach people how to prune and how to do all this stuff. So that kind of thing is out there. And of course, there's always YouTube, right? So look at your resources, figure out what it is that you can do in regards to pruning. And sometimes you're going to have to make that decision that this might be a little bit out of my league. I'll let a professional do it. The next thing we're going to look at is nutrient to water allocation. Giving the tree or the shrub the right type of fertilizer in the right time of the season is very important. So we want to make sure that we're fertilizing our trees or our shrubs when they're actually going into that part of the cycle like we talked about earlier. One of the things you definitely don't want to do is provide a high nitrogen content right before the tree or the shrub tries to shut down for the season. Or it's going to go through another growth spurt and then not have a chance to shut that material down and prepare itself for the winter. A process us nerds in the industry called hardening off. Now, a little trick that I use to remember is in the spring, we're going to give it a high nitrogen content. That's going to help push new green growth. So when you look at the three numbers on the bag, you're going to see something like a 30-10-10 general tree and shrub fertilizer. That means that 30% of that bag is going to be nitrogen. The other 10% phosphorus, the other 10% potassium. Now, in that bag, they might have macro and micronutrients, which includes copper, boron, manganese, all that fun junk. So, making sure that you have a general tree and shrub fertilizer will, for the most part, tick off all your boxes. Now, if we're going to use a 30-10-10 in the spring, that's like after the fruit production has just started, the tree's really starting to put on linear growth through its tips. That's when we want to give it nitrogen. As the progress of the tree moves throughout the year, what we want to do is we don't want to give it more nitrogen, because once the fruit production is done and we start having the fruit fall off the tree, we're going to have leaf change because it's fall. This is going to stimulate kind of the next step in its cycle. Once it's created all this energy, maybe it has a surplus, it wants to send that energy down into its root system. So this is actually going to stimulate an increase in root growth more so than it has experienced thus far in the summer. Meaning, well, some trees can actually go up to like 1.5 times their root growth for the entire summer just in the fall. So what can we do? We want to support that, right? Because everything we're doing with fertilizer and water and fruit production, it's all about support, not force. So remember, in the spring we're using a 30-10-10. We're going to flip that around. In the fall, we're going to try to get a 10-30-30. Okay? So let's work it out. 30-10-10 in the spring, 10-30-30 in the fall. Say it with me now. 30-10-10 in the spring, 10-30-30 in the fall. You're not saying it with me. 30-10-10 in the spring, 10-30-30 in the fall. Okay? Pretty easy. Just remember those numbers. And if you said it with me all times, I'm pretty sure you're going to remember next time you go to your farm and garden store. Now, don't go to the store and expect them to actually have a 30-10-10. They might have like a 38-8. So just remember, when we're dealing with these numbers, it's more about understanding how they work. And so if they have a 30-20-20, I mean, okay, you can peel back that phosphorus and potassium content with your fall fertilizer because you've already given it that nutrient, right? So depending on the amount of precipitation and how much leaching of these nutrients in the soil, you can play around. I generally speaking will tell homeowners, give or take 5 or 10%. I mean, a little bit of something is better than nothing. So just remember that at the end of the day, when we're fertilizing our trees as a part of our means to, keep the tree healthy, we want to do it so that we're just benefiting the tree to the point where we're not forcing it to do anything. We're just trying to replace what naturally happens in a forest. So big shout out to treefeed.ca there, because they're the ones that just changed the way I thought about fertilizer forever. Okay, so you gave it some fertilizer, great. You got to give it water too. Guys, water is like one of the biggest influencers of tree health. So it grows all these plant parts, but it needs water to actually cause those cells to expand. So if you're trying to get your tree to grow, well, reason states that you should give it some water, because that's actually what those cells are going to expand with, right? So don't go and put a bunch of fertilizer down and then cuss and point at your tree when you're talking to your neighbors because you forgot to turn the tap on. And I have a pretty good trick that works for knowing exactly where to start when you're trying to figure out how much water to give your tree or your shrub. So this is how it works. Dig a hole in your backyard. fill it up with water. Okay, have you done it? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so fill it up with water, and the idea being is you need to figure out how quickly that water is going to drain. Depending on where you live and what kind of soils you're dealing with, sandy soils will drain faster than clay soils. So you want to make sure that if you're putting 2 gallons of water down on the ground, it's going to actually drain through the soil within the next couple of hours, because we don't want to reduce the amount of oxygen getting to the roots. A little fun fact here, too much water actually equals not enough oxygen. That's why you can overwater a plant. You're pushing the oxygen out of the soil. So the first thing you want to do, dig a hole, make sure that that water's actually going to go somewhere. Then, once you've actually dug your hole and you can fill it with water, you want to make sure that you count at least for every inch of diameter of tree, you're giving it 2 gallons per week. So that's like a starting place, right? That's a very small amount of water, like barely none at all. A newly planted tree actually uses more than that. But because as trees mature, they actually tap into other resources than just, say, the water that you're giving it. Maybe your neighbor waters their lawn, but you don't. So it's decided that it's going to go sponge off your neighbor's property because you're cheap. This might actually be a good time to go fill that hole back in, unless you want your neighbor cussing at you because you left a giant hole in the middle of the yard. So that's more of a temporary thing. Moving along. Okay, so let's break it down. What are the 3 steps? 1, regular pruning. 2, I water and I fertilize my tree just after fruit production, because that's when the fruit's starting to form, and that's when I try to pull the tree out of the stress mode, right? So I'm kind of putting my hands up in little mini air quotes here, stress mode. It isn't only stress, it is a process that the tree's going through, but if we're trying to increase fruit production, then, we want to try to stress it just a little bit. Number 3, I'm constantly inspecting for insect and disease issues. So remember, reducing the insects like, say, apple maggot and diseases like canker or apple scab, it's important because once you put all that effort into your fruit tree, you're expecting this abundance of fruit just to find out, oh, I can't eat any of it because every single apple has apple maggot. So you should be inspecting your fruit tree regularly. That's really going to help you in the long run. And it's kind of the third side or the third pillar of fruit production is, pruning, health, insect, and disease. If you cover those 3 things, you're usually going to have some pretty delicious edible fruit, as long as you're not eating something that's definitely a bird berry. Those are definitely going to give you a night to remember, because only birds should be eating them. You know what? Don't eat anything unless you know exactly what it is. You remember that commercial? Don't you put it in your mouth, don't you put it in your mouth. Okay, if you're like 90s and up, you might remember that. Anyways, just don't eat it if you don't know what it is. Crab apples, not all of them are edible. Some of them, definitely a choking hazard, and maybe a tooth-breaking hazard, depending on the variety. So, I hope that you actually learned something. You have to remember, fruit production is stress production. It's stress management. Everything with trees is about managing the amount of stress that they're encountering. That can help us manage fruit production. So if you come from the school of thought that you hate fruit trees, you'd rather not have all the wasps, then you can kind of just go backwards on what we were talking about here. If you want less fruit production, then give it tons and tons of water in the spring and the fall, so that it doesn't think that every year is just another year of have-not. Have it regularly fertilized. Have it regularly pruned, but don't go in and start doing things that are going to increase fruit production. Don't go and do an orchard prune on a tree that you're trying not to grow fruit on. I mean, to a certain extent, there's really nothing we can do. So remember, if you go and you buy a fruit tree because, oh, it's adorable, look at the little flowers, and then like 2 years later, you're kind of like, you know what, I don't really love the fruit. It's a little tart. I don't really need it. It's like the fruit tree isn't going to just stop producing fruit. So know what you're buying when you buy it. Know what you eat when you're eating it. And I hope that you learned something. If you're looking for more resources, you can check out kearnsyconsult.ca. I have a lot of information as well as some courses online that are available if you're in the Saskatoon area. So thank you very much for joining the show today. I love talking into a microphone by myself in the living room, so I really hope to see the comments and the likes. Otherwise, I'm just a crazy person talking about fruit trees to the air. So have an amazing day, take care of yourself, and make sure you take care of your fruit trees too.